Good evening and welcome to the City of Dana Point Virtual Community Workshop for the Housing and Public Safety General Plan Element Update. My name is Belinda Dinas, Principal Planner, and I'm grateful you have taken the time to join us for this virtual workshop on two very important topics, both of which set the foundation for Dana Point's vision as a vibrant, world-class place, as well as Dana Point's mission to set a standard for an exceptionally livable city. I'm pleased to introduce to you the team working with me on this effort. From city staff, I'm joined by Brenda Wisniewski, Director of Community Development, and Jeff Rossler, Community Development Manager. The city is contracted with local planning firm Placeworks to prepare these documents. And from their staff, we have Colin Drucker and Corey Witter here to lead the presentation. Before we get started on the presentation, I invite any of our attendees to please utilize the Q&A chat box function if you would like to ask us questions throughout the workshop. Questions will be directed to the panelists and answers may be shared with the group as written or live response. Following the presentation, we will have an open question and answer session for attendees to speak. We ask that comments be generally limited to 3 minutes to allow attendees to have an opportunity to participate. Please note that this workshop is being recorded and that this video may be posted on the city's YouTube page for future reference. With that, I would like to turn it over to Colin for the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to show my face just so people can know who's talking. I'm Colin Drucker, Principal with Placeworks. But I'm going to turn my video off so you can see the full screen, just in case you're, depending on what you're viewing it on. So as Belinda said, we're going to be talking about two different topics, but mostly the housing element. And the housing element is a long-term plan that the city maintains and updates regularly to look at not only future housing needs, but also all of the existing housing needs in the city. It is a required element of the city's general plan, which is the overall blueprint for the city's long-term planning. It addresses issues like land use, circulation, safety. And this is one of the only elements of the general plan that has a regular update cycle that's mandated by law. Most general plan elements need to be updated as the jurisdiction sees fit, but the housing element is required to be updated in a cyclical fashion. This requirement is administered by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. They also certify the housing element. It's the only element of the general plan that needs to get certified by the state. The safety element also has to get reviewed by the state, but it does not follow the same certification process. So as I mentioned, that 8-year cycle for this time period, it is the years 2021 to 2029. The council is targeting an adoption deadline of October. That's the deadline written into state law right now. However, there's also a 120-day grace period just in case, but right now we're looking to shoot towards that October deadline. So the housing element contains a lot of material. It's a very lengthy, complex document that we try to provide some straightforward policy direction and analysis, but it has a lot of topics that it covers. So it looks at what are the housing needs of people today and what, if any, constraints are around from the city, from the state, from others that would limit the production of housing. It also looks at the city's programs in the past and tries to evaluate and communicate how the city has done and what changes are needed and why. And then it takes that input and it produces new goals, policies, and programs to try and promote more safer and affordable housing. And then the most kind of well-known component of the housing element is the section related to the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA allocation. So this is a number that is first handed down by the state to a sub-region and then ultimately broken down to the city of Dana Point in the amount of future housing need that the city must accommodate on the lands and zone for it. So I'll go into that in more detail later. So there was other outreach done in the past. Housing is an ongoing and ever-evolving topic. The city participates with the county's consolidated plan. It is one of the entitlement cities. It means that the County helps to facilitate some of the federal housing funds that can go and get spent in the city. And so there was a number of outreach meetings that occurred in late 2019. And so we took that information that covers a lot of the similar topics that we cover in the housing element into consideration. Then we have re-engaged with some of the key stakeholders in the community in 2020 and 2021. Those are listed on the screen there. They represent a variety of voices from advocacy groups, not-for-profit, and mission-driven organizations, and the private market. There are also some public meetings that the city has been holding and a survey that was distributed in 2021. You can see that listed on the screen. Tonight, we're talking about the virtual public workshop. There's also going to be a pop-up workshop that talks about not only the housing and safety element, but also Doheny Village and other issues and there's more information on the city's website for that. And then the intent is to go communicate with the Planning Commission on this coming Monday and go to the City Council to get the authorization to submit the draft element to the state. Of course, we're going to be taking all of the public input that we've received so far and what we hear tonight and at the Planning Commission into consideration. We also have the draft element sections prepared to date up on the city's website so that you can review those and provide comments. And those primarily cover the housing evaluation, the evaluation of past programs, and the constraints and resources, specifically the land resources for the RHNA. We're going to be getting into the programs in the following week based on the input we hear tonight. So I'm just going to go over some quick highlights of the existing housing needs. As I said, there's a lot of information, but here's some of the points that make it clear what everybody kind of already knows participating in the housing market out there, that the Dana Point is a very desirable place to live, and the housing prices have continued to escalate faster than wages, of course, and owning a home here is a very expensive thing to do. And renting here is not cheap either. And the average rent here is about $2,000 for a one-bedroom, and overpayment is a substantial issue in the city for renters. In many cases, they do choose to pay more, but in other cases, they do not have enough income in order to live here. The average household size in Dana Point is very small. When you look at the next slide, you'll see it goes into the age of the population. And essentially what we've seen over the last 20 years is people have moved here and they like it here and they've stayed here. And they either started with families and now that family's leaving the nest, or they came here at a late age and they are staying here into their retirement. So you see a much smaller household size, and that's largely because we think people are aging in place. The citywide median age has gone up and up and up. And then the issues not only extend to those who are housed, but those who have a hard time getting into housing. And so the city participates with the county in the point in time survey, and it also does some of their own outreach. And it looks like there are a number of individuals, some family members who are experiencing homelessness in the city. And so I'll go into some of the city's approach a little bit later on. Some of the new issues that have come up just this cycle, there was some legislation passed in 2018, and it wanted to provide a stronger analysis and connection of fair housing and the housing element. There are other documents that you may see around the internet and other jurisdictions called analyses of impediments to fair housing or fair housing analysis. Not every jurisdiction necessarily produces those. This bill now changes it so that every housing element must address fair housing, and looking at not just evaluating what the statistics are, but looking at actions and programs that will affirmatively further fair housing and prioritize improvements and funding for those areas experiencing fair housing issues. These are some maps. Don't worry about trying to read into them. We're going to be producing more information for the public later on, but these are just some of the issues that we're analyzing in an attempt to understand the fair housing issues that are present in Dana Point. We anticipate covering these, probably some more there might be some changes. We're really looking for what is meaningful for Dana Point. We're not looking just to throw data on the wall. So we want to understand what are the issues, why have they come about, and what can be done about it. Now, that's the existing housing needs snapshot. Looking at future housing needs, this is that RHNA reference I mentioned at the very beginning, Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So the state of California assigns a projected growth number to that acronym there, SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments. That's the regional body that covers Dana Point. And that 1.34 million is a forecasted need of new housing over the next 8 years. It's a much larger number than in years past, in part because the state is trying to account for the pent-up demand that has not been met in the last 8 to 16 years. Dana Point has received 530 of those units, and it's broken down in the way that you see on the screen into these different income categories, and those are all based off of a percentage of the median income in the county. Obviously, the county fairly affluent overall, Dana Point as well. So very low and low income households are not those earning $10,000 to $15,000 a year only. That can include people and families and households earning up to $80,000, $100,000 a year, and they still struggle to provide and to afford housing. So here's some real numbers to put it into perspective about what is affordable when we're talking about those income categories. So if you're a young couple or roommates, this is how you fit into these categories. So if you're, let's say, starting out in your career and you have one of you who works and you're earning $50,000, then you can only afford $1,300 a month in rent. Oftentimes people will double up, and that's sometimes why you see overcrowded households. There's not that condition in Dana Point. The overcrowding rate is very low, which seems to indicate that people are opting to move here and sometimes overpay for housing. In other cases, they're managing to afford it by adding additional people who earn salaries. If you're a family or a larger household where you have multiple, usually income earners, then the numbers go up a bit. There's an assumption that you're going to be later in your career and earning a little bit more. So you can see there that the affordable monthly rent for very low is $1,600, and for low income it's $2,500. So still pretty big numbers, but as you can tell by looking at the listings, those numbers are still sometimes hard to come by in the Dana Point area. And then looking at the housing prices, we can see that obviously, with the exception of some very small units that might come on, most units are selling now for $800,000, $1 million, and it becomes increasingly out of reach for people who don't earn a significant income. And when we talk about who needs affordable housing, it's again not somebody who there's the stereotype of people who aren't working, who are lazy or something, and that's just plain wrong. It's really about people who are in the community providing critical services. In some cases, they're starting out in their career. In other cases, they're providing those key services that help the local economy. So this is something that's desperately needed for a large segment of the community. So how do you accommodate those 530 units? And what the city does is it first looks at whether or not there's any existing or proposed projects that are in the pipeline that a property owner or a developer have submitted for approval, and those can count towards your future need. There's also the most common, which is your vacant or underutilized land. So vacant land is pretty easy to understand. There's nothing on there. Underutilized is an evaluation of whether or not the use that is currently occupying a piece of land is likely to stick around or is really intense and profitable enough for the homeowner or the property owner in order to be maintained. Or perhaps that new residential development would provide a better profit or a greater rate of return for that property owner, and so they're incentivized to redevelop that property. The state understands that affordable housing is very hard to do, especially in Southern California, and that any affordable project, for the most part, is going to require some significant degree of subsidy. What the city's obligation is to zone the land in order to accommodate affordable housing. Now, what zoning level, what density is suitable for affordable housing? For many years, it was just kind of unknown, and there was a discussion and arguments put forth back and forth between the cities and the state, and it was a matter of convincing that based on example projects, what density was good. So state law was changed, and the state instituted that for an urban place like Orange County, that 30 units an acre is not necessarily automatically affordable by any stretch of the imagination, but it is more affordable than, let's say, 10, 20 units an acre. You can get more units on the parcel, and that reduces the cost of development on a per unit basis, which allows the developer and the property owner to reduce the price per unit. So what we do is we look at, it's a long way of saying, we look at vacant and underutilized land and see if we can zone it for at least 30 units an acre. There's also accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Some people might have heard of these as second units or granny flats. These are becoming increasingly popular way of providing affordable housing. And the city has participated on promoting these for a number of years, but they've really increased in popularity only recently because there have been changes in state law that facilitate and streamline their approval. And also the increasing crunch on the housing market means that if somebody can put a unit for, let's say, their adult children, put an extra unit on their property that they've already paid for, they only need to pay for the cost of construction, and they can rent out that ADU for either nothing, as we're seeing evidence of in some cases, or a very low cost amount. And then the rate of return for them is 5 to 10 years, and then they have it paid for. So ADUs are a good way and a good solution. The other important thing to note is that the city, unlike in past cycles, must either have the units affordable on market rate built equal to their RHNA, or maintain enough land capacity for that housing to be built all the way through 2029. And if it does fall short, because let's say a property owner comes in and develops a property in a way that is not consistent, then it's the city's obligation to go find more land and zone it appropriately. I'm going to go through some of the sites that we've identified. The first opportunity site is a Ralph's anchored shopping center in the town center. Discussions indicate that shopping center may not stay there. There's a leasing agreement that may be up soon. And so the density that is being assumed there is 40 units an acre, so above that 30. The actual town center plan allows for a much higher density. And when you see that capacity at 50% affordable, that doesn't mean that the project's going to be affordable, that it's going to have 50% of the units as affordable. What it means is that because this site can be considered underutilized, and because the density meets that 30 units an acre threshold, what's called the default density thresholds, that the city can assume that there is some capacity for affordable housing on it. To be conservative, we're not assuming 100% capacity. We are assuming just 50% capacity. But as you'll see, there are a number of other sites we've added to make sure that if one of these sites doesn't build in the exact way that we anticipated here, that there's still sufficient capacity. So in the Doheny Village area, which is pending, we anticipate that being approved before the adoption date of the housing element. Obviously, if anything changes, we'll adapt. There are a number of sites in there where the city has added a housing incentive overlay that allows for a slight increase in density, and that is before any sort of state density bonus law is applied. And the densities here meet, again, that state default density threshold. And so here we're assuming 50% affordable on the sites that are in the northern part of the screen here. And on the other site, it's owned by the adjacent church. And so it's been vacant for a while, used as overflow parking. We're assuming a higher level of affordability there, given the mission-driven position of the property owner. Adjacent to those is Victoria Boulevard. This is a pending project, anticipated either to be adopted slightly before or sometime after, but it'll still be during the planning period. And that project has an inclusionary housing component where 5% of the units are reserved for very low income households, 5% for low, and 5% for moderate. So a total there of 15% lower and moderate go towards the RHNA allocation. We're not counting any additional affordability otherwise. Then there is a surplus site that's owned by South Coast Water District. This was in the previous housing element cycle, and it's in the CF zone, which allows higher density housing, and with the public owner and the density there, we're assuming 100% affordability. Then, as I mentioned, there's ADUs. Here's some pictures of what ADUs might look like, and those that have been built in California. As I said, though, it's an increasingly popular way for either adult children, aging parents to be housed without having to try to double up or triple up in this crowded and expensive housing market, or for homeowners to simply generate some additional income. So there's 3 different types you can see there. There's the fully detached, where you're not connected. It's basically like having a separate structure in someone's backyard. The attached, where you share a wall. And then there's something called a junior ADU, which just has a smaller number of features and amenities. And it can also sometimes be developed just by converting a room in a house or a garage. Now, there does need to be external access so that people can still maintain independence and privacy. These, based on interviews with ADU builders, looking at prices, there's been surveys that have been done regionally and statewide. Generally, they are becoming affordable without any subsidy. In some cases, there might be some minor subsidy in the future that might be needed as they become more popular. But right now, because the land has already been paid for, you're really just talking about the cost of construction. And in Southern California, the vast majority of the cost of housing is to pay for the price of land when you're talking about a single family home. So this offers a much more affordable way of people to access housing. It does rely upon the property owners doing this, however. This is not something where you'll have a developer come in and do 50 ADUs at a time. This is property by property. State laws change that you can do, in some cases, a junior ADU and an attached ADU at the same time. But in general, it's going to be property owner by a property owner. And the city has seen an increased level of interest. And right now, we're just permitting or projecting that the city could attract about 10 units per year, and about 70 to 75% of those we think it would be safe to assume would be affordable. And that's adjusted for the household size, because you're probably going to be seeing 1- and 2-person households in these units, although we are seeing an increasing number of units occupied by 3-person households. So this is a summary table of the city's land inventory, their capacity to accommodate the RHNA. And I'll just repeat, this is all about capacity. The city is not in the business of developing housing. The city cannot force people to develop housing. Redevelopment law passed quite a while ago, so there are some tools that the city doesn't have, and in some cases, people don't want the city to have or use. And so it's really reliant upon the city to use its primary tool, which is zoning and the municipal code, to encourage and facilitate housing. So it's identified enough sites to accommodate a surplus of capacity at the beginning of this planning period for the lower income RHNA, which is the hardest part. The market rate housing generally takes care of that above moderate income, and oftentimes with rental products, it can pretty easily cover the moderate income as well. For the lower income, obviously, as the sites may be developed, the city is going to be monitoring the sites on an ongoing basis. And if there is any shortfall in its capacity, then the city will rezone another adequate site or more as needed. AB 686, that fair housing bill that I mentioned earlier, that was passed in 2018. One of the key points is that it requires a jurisdiction to evaluate these housing opportunity sites in comparison to patterns of fair housing around the city. And this is, it's something that is very difficult to apply on a case-by-case basis, because there's so many facets of fair housing. But the map you see here, TCAC, that's the tax credit a program that the state runs to incentivize affordable housing. What they do is they map out a number of issues that are related to fair housing. They deal with income, they deal with diversity, they deal with access to resources like transit or schools. And then they compile all of those numbers and try to assess areas of low resource, moderate resource, or high resource. And that's resources, like I mentioned, transit, well-performing schools, whether or not there's high rates of overpayment or overcrowding. And the idea is that jurisdictions should try as much as possible to identify sites that will be in areas that are not already experiencing some fair housing issues. With a jurisdiction like Dana Point that's essentially built out, that can be tough for a city that has identified two growth areas like the town center and Doheny Village and prepared plans before the 2018 law was passed. It can be especially difficult. And so when we align the city's land inventory with the map, you can see that the housing sites do fall into that low resource area. There is one that is in a moderate income or a moderate resource area, but that is one of the reasons why the city has looked to expand its ADU focus and to potentially look at additional conversion options in the moderate or the above or the high resource areas. And those moderate and high resource areas are the most likely to experience and accommodate ADUs. It's a lot of single family homes with larger lots that can accommodate something like an external structure. So the law does not require that the city only distribute housing sites throughout the moderate and high resource, but it does try to ensure that the analysis is in there and that if there are other opportunities that come around, that the city take advantage of those. Now I'm going to briefly go over some of the recent activities that the city has undertaken in order to promote affordable housing. So in 2017, there was a market rate multifamily apartment complex, and the city entered into an agreement to form a joint powers authority to raise millions in revenue bonds to convert those apartments to become permanently affordable to extremely low income households. So this project called Silver Lantern, it is intended for those earning up to 30% of the median income, most likely those experiencing homelessness, to transition into permanent housing. In 2018, the city adopted some waivers and cutting of fees in order to assist special needs groups, including those for lower income housing, either as a standalone project or as part of a mixed income project. So reducing the cost of developing housing. And then there are, on an ongoing basis, are projects such as the South Cove townhouses, where 17 of the units are reserved for below market rate, in this case, moderate income. These are ownership units. And that was done as a condition of approval to implement the Coastal Act and the Mellow Act. And then there is the Victoria Apartments project that I mentioned earlier, where 15% are being reserved for lower and moderate in perpetuity. And then finally, the city, again, is trying to incentivize affordable housing, in part by offering a city density bonus in certain areas before the state density bonus would get applied. And so the housing incentive overlay is applied in the Doheny Village area, which is pending approval. And this aligns with the housing element sites and would go to further incentivize people to maximize their development potential on the site, and in part by including affordable housing. And then the city has had an ongoing effort to assist those experiencing homelessness. They established a task force in 2014, hired a liaison officer, and then contracts with Mercy House for outreach and strategies. A work plan was published and finalized in 2017. And as of 2020, last year, they helped to house 48 individuals transitioning from homelessness into housing. looking at the future programs, this is in part what we want to hear about tonight, get input on. What we've asked in the survey is what programs does the city need and how should they change their existing programs to better address housing? So to date, the screen shows what we have heard in terms of what the public feels are the priority goals and activities to assist those on the topic of housing in Dana Point. So in general, what we're seeing is that people are favoring assisting those that are unable to afford market rate housing, address fair housing, particularly look at those who are connected to the local economy and work in the service industry, and continue to assist those experiencing homelessness. Some of the strategies that have been raised are more broad inclusionary housing fee and an emphasis on building more, supporting more transitional or supportive or emergency housing. Some of the key changes to city housing programs that are in part driven by state law include an emphasis on facilitating more supportive housing and allowing such housing to be permitted by right where multifamily and mixed uses are permitted. That emphasis on fair housing that I talked about earlier and strengthening the programs of throughout the housing element on addressing the topic. Also streamlining, SB 35 you might see mentioned, and it is triggered when the city is proceeding along throughout the planning period, and proportionally that 530 unit RHNA, every year you divide that 530 by 8 for each income category, and that is the proportional amount of housing that the state would like to see built or permitted every year. If there's just not the interest, or the property and the developers are not aligning, or there's a number of reasons why that housing is not getting promoted or permitted, then state law kicks in and further incentivizes housing development by making sure that certain projects that include a portion of affordable housing, depending on what type of housing is or is not getting built, and make sure that those are permitted by right, and that the process is as streamlined as possible. There's also the expansion of supportive and emergency shelter uses in the form of a low barrier navigation center. So oftentimes people who experience homeless have stated that they will not use emergency shelters because they have a pet like a dog, and that a lot of emergency shelters don't permit those, or that they're only allowed to have a backpack and that they have to dump the rest of their possessions. So you do see people who do not choose to stay in emergency shelters, and instead of simply forcing them to do that, the state has opted to encourage what are called low barrier navigation centers that remove a lot of those barriers to why people were not using them, and ensure that those shelters have services that focus on moving people into permanent housing. And if you build a low barrier navigation center, then the city must allow that by right in areas that are zoned for mixed use or non-residential zones that permit multifamily uses. So that is a quick 30-minute stroll through the housing element. I'm going to briefly touch on the safety element, and then we're going to open it up for questions. And the reason why my discussion on the safety element is very brief is because the changes in state law and the safety element are fairly minor in their general nature. They're substantial in their implications, but they're very focused. And so we're not doing an overhaul like we are with the housing element. So the safety element does require some periodic updates, simply because a lot of state law seems to be connected to the safety element. And so new laws are passed a little more frequently when it comes to the issue of public safety. The safety element addresses what types of natural or human-caused disasters and threats might face a city, and understands programs and policies that the city would have in place in order to promote enhanced public safety. It also considers all of these various documents that are being managed and prepared in parallel like those that are listed on the screen. The county maintains a plan, the city has its own emergency plan, and the city has also done some of its own independent assessments on issues like sea level rise. So one of the new requirements is to look at increased requirements about flood safety and coordination and minimizing of risk. So as I mentioned, the city had done that assessment, so we're leveraging that and expanding upon it. And here you see a map of the fire hazard severity zones. Obviously, there are not significant areas in the city in terms of the sheer land coverage that are at risk for fire hazard given the coastal location. But obviously you can see certain parts of the city are at greater risk than others. The main new addition to the safety element, besides those are more very specific updates on increased flood risk and fire risk and making sure that certain policies and programs are in place. The more substantial addition is addressing the issue of climate adaptation and resiliency. So resiliency is that ability to recover from not just a natural disaster, but ongoing threats and persistent strengthening weather conditions. So how well you can recover from a bad event, both from a personal level, a public safety level, and even an economic level. And so the safety element looks at the vulnerability of the city's various assets and places and people to threats like drought, increasing droughts, extreme droughts, other types of weather conditions, and then craft some goals and policies and strategies to address those. Some of them overlap with what the city already has adopted so far. So in some cases, it's just a minor tweaking of the safety topics. And in other cases, there's introduction of new issues and policies. So in 2020, everyone knows I think we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic. There was a lot of guidance from ACD and review of new laws. We engaged the public in a little bit 2020 and then mostly in 2021 recently. And then we started to publish review drafts available for the public to read. And then those dates about going to the Planning Commission and City Council. That is not the adoption hearings. That's just to give them a look and obtain the City Council's approval to submit the document to the state. And then the state will conduct its review. And then once we obtain information from the state, we will come back later in the fall and go through the adoption process. So if you want more information, there's information on the city's website. Here are some individuals that you can contact at the city. As Belinda mentioned, she's one of them, and Jeff is here as well. If you have not already taken the online survey, there's the link there. There's a link on the city's website. We're keeping it open at least until the end of May. And we still, depending on the level of interest, we may leave it open even longer. We want to make sure to collect people's input. So if you haven't taken it, please do so. If you know somebody else who should take it, please distribute it far and wide for people who have a stake in housing in Data Point. And with that, I will turn it back over to Belinda and remain available for questions.
Thank you, Colin. So we will go ahead and open the workshop for comments. If you would like to pose a question or provide comments verbally, please click on the raise hand button and city staff will call on your name in the order received and you will be unmuted. We also welcome any comments also in the Q&A chat box as well. We have one question or comment for Maura. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Maura.
Hi, Belinda. Thank you all for that presentation. I actually have so many questions. So I'll start with one and then please let me know if I can have an opportunity to ask the others. I have so many, so I apologize, but you mentioned meeting with stakeholders and I noticed that one of the groups was the building industry. Can someone speak to what the building industry's interests are and how they do or do not align with the needs of Dana Point residents? And how much influence do they have and why?
You want me to address that, Belinda? Okay. So we spoke with representatives of the BAA to understand primarily what constraints they see that are in city regulations or maybe state building codes that increase the cost of housing or increase the time needed for getting housing permitted and entitled. That's the primary piece of information we want to extract from them, is from their point of view, the people who build a lot of the housing, where are greater efficiencies possible, and how can we get housing costs to come down. We know that there are some members of the Building Industry Association who focus on workforce housing, and some who even do lower income housing, but most of it is market rate housing. And we take that in consideration in terms of their input, but it is focused mostly on how can we streamline housing, which will help not only market rate housing, but also affordable housing.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Maura, if you wanted another question, feel free and unmute yourself. Maura?
Okay, thank you. It was mentioned twice in the presentation that 48 individuals were housed, people who had been experiencing homelessness. And I'm wondering how that is defined, and who defines it. What does it mean to be housed?
I'll take that one, Colin. So our staff who works with our homeless liaison, it's a combination of different things when they are out working with our homeless population. So based on my conversations with our Kelly Renders, who is our assistant city manager, it could be a number of things from transitional housing to permanent housing, and also just assisting people back to their homes as well. So it's not strictly permanent housing for that number of 48.
Okay, yeah, if I could, am I still unmuted that I can comment on that?
Yes.
Okay. I would request that the housing element have a very specific definition for housed that only includes permanent housing, because as an advocate working with people experiencing homelessness, I mean, I see practically zero people housed, and I see people talking about someone being housed, but they're just in a motel for a couple months and then they're back on the street. So I think to be accurate, you might want to get, or I would request that you get a good definition of housed that only includes permanent housing.
Noted, thank you. Any other questions? Maura, I see your hand up again.
Oh my God. This is going to be
Everyone else is shy.
Too funny in the recording. Okay, so I have a question about ADUs. So I assume a lot of ADUs are built for young adult children, you know, maybe the mother-in-law, those kinds of things. And so I think it was mentioned that often they're free, right? You know, you might not charge rent for your young adult. But I wonder if there's any tracking of those ADUs that, you know, they just stay in the family and that they're never truly rented, or worse than that if they are rented, but they're not rented to be affordable. I mean, as you can see, room rentals in the city, studios in the city, everything is unaffordable to people with the lowest incomes. So I would assume that ADUs are also going to be unaffordable. And is there any kind of tracking of that?
Right now, the city, when an application for an ADU comes in, we survey the property owners for what an estimated rental cost would be. And so they're not subject to any limitation, but generally the rental rates that we have received have been in the affordable categories, oftentimes in the low and very low categories. So we haven't seen that, and we're not required to follow up in terms of what that annual rental rate might be. However, we do track that those rental rates as part of our annual reporting to the state.
And I think to add on to that, one of the reasons why it can get exaggerated, the potential for ADUs to accommodate the RHNA allocation, and we're not trying to do that here. We're looking at a relatively modest number of a total of 80, of which I think we assume 59 would be potentially affordable between 2021 and 2029. And the reason why that number I think is fairly reasonable is because when you consider, as you said, and as I've talked about earlier, the people who might be occupying these, oftentimes we're seeing the greatest number of adult children living with their parents, I think, since the Great Depression. And that's in part because the housing prices are incredibly high. So the other alternative for that adult child or children would be to try to enter the housing market that is already very expensive. And so an ADU is very legitimately a housing option for them. And ideally for them, their parents or the property owner has either no rent or cheap rent. And they are staying there for an increasing number of years. And then in the if the adult children can leave, or let's say if let's stick with the adult children right now, because they'll be more likely to leave. Then once they do depart, then the homeowner has a potential option to obviously start charging more rent for that, and it may or may not be affordable. But oftentimes many years have passed, and we see that people primarily try to obtain the maximum rent when they first build something. But it is reasonable to assume that as housing prices continue to escalate and you see room rates going up, that ADUs would not necessarily be 100% affordable, and that the affordability rates may go down in the next planning period for sure. But I think for right now, what we're seeing, not just in Dana Point, but we've been surveying other jurisdictions, talking to property owners, asking them how many occupants they have and looking at the rents. And we're getting rates anywhere between 50 and 94% at various jurisdictions. So we think we're putting in a reasonable assumption and not trying to overestimate.
I don't know if I'm still muted, but thank you for that.
Any other questions for the group? I see a question, hand raised for Daisy. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Daisy.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Daisy Cruz, and I'm calling, I'm with the Kennedy Commission, and I was just wondering, we can see that for Dana Point, the city didn't meet its 5th cycle RHNA goals among very low and low income specifically. And I'm wondering if, I'm not sure if it was included, if an inclusionary housing ordinance is something that is being considered, that would require a minimum of 15 to 20% affordable housing units in new developments.
Belinda, I would defer to you on inclusionary housing.
Brenda, are you on the line as well?
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you wanted me to respond to that. Well, inclusionary housing is not something that we have in our current program, but it is something that could be potentially discussed by our decision makers going forward. So if you wanted to make that comment, that's certainly something that would be included.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm still muted. Thank you. I just wanted to include that because there are other cities that are starting to include that in their housing element moving forward, and other cities that have been successful in meeting their RHNA goals by including an inclusionary housing ordinance. I'll end my comment there. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. All right. If you would have any questions or would like to submit any written comments, please feel free to email me directly at bdinas@danapoint.org. So this concludes our Housing and Public Safety Element Workshop.
Belinda, we've got sorry to interrupt you, but we have some Maura in the chat, so she has more questions. So I saw her hand raised briefly, but then I saw it go down. So forgive me if Maura doesn't actually have any more questions. I just saw it in the chat and it was time-stamped from just a minute ago. So
okay, Maura, did you have any follow-up questions?
Yes, I do. I do. What time are we supposed to wrap up?
We didn't have a specified end date.
Okay.
Or time, excuse me.
Okay. You know what, maybe I'll just ask like a handful of questions because they're kind of on a similar topic, and then you can speak to whichever ones you want. So in regards to the property where Ralph's is right now, it was mentioned that there has been a little bit of talk with the landowner, but I'm wondering, like, I mean, I think we need a grocery store there. Does that mean the whole thing's going to be developed potentially, or the store is still there? Then another question regarding sites is, has the city considered donating any sites or the water district site? Because I know affordable housing doesn't happen too easily without free land, or I should say with free land, it happens way more easily. Also, what happened to the property that was along the creek from the previous cycle? It was a water district property also. And then is the property, the other water district property that borders on San Clemente, is that, can you speak to the feasibility of that site for the actual building of affordable housing?
So we don't lose track of your questions, Maura. Maybe we can go ahead and start talking about some of the ones you've already raised. The first one related to the property in Town Center, the Ralph's property. We have just had some preliminary discussions with the property owner. They approached us looking at opportunities for them to redevelop that property. It isn't, they are still planning on having some type of larger retail at that location, but they're also looking at a mixed use element. So it's very early in the process. It's probably been maybe 6 or 8 months since I have talked to them in detail about their plans, but they have just kind of started the discussions with us. The other question about, does the city have any property to donate? The city of Dana Point really doesn't have any property. You know, we have very small pockets here and there, but nothing that would be really suitable for housing, unfortunately. But I totally agree that would be a great situation if we did. The water district properties, the one that was along the flood channel, I believe, Belinda, they had requested not to be included. Is that correct? Yeah, she's not.
Correct.
So,
and particular, if I may, Brenda, that particular property is slated for where the desalination plant is proposed.
And the comment related to the one that is in at the border. What was the question about that, Moira?
Just if you can speak to the feasibility of it. I think it was a potential site for 25 units, 100% affordable. And I've seen that property, and I don't know, the feasibility of that property for that purpose just, I don't know, seems a little questionable.
I'll jump in if that's okay. So we looked at, and I can go to the site so we can all look at it. All right, so this site, it at first appears kind of landlocked, but it actually has a couple of points, 2 points of potential roadway access. The state does not like to see sites that are less than a half an acre. And this surpasses that threshold. 25 units an acre is fairly pretty easy to do on an acre land. We've talked with private development. They can get in some, it's either a very low density stacked flat type situation, or it's skinny townhomes type deal, tuck under, where the parking goes underneath. And that's something that we see. You can almost kind of look at the complex to the right, just to the east of it, and you can pretty much get about those number of units just by kind of taking a few of the pads over there and popping it on over to that site. So the fact that it's publicly owned in some cases can be a constraint, because the water district may not have an incentive to move that, may want to keep it, but they're okay listing it. But what's really good is that oftentimes when it's publicly owned, they're not necessarily primarily looking to maximize the sales price on it. What we have the most difficult time in developing housing is property owners who want to get the most amount of money out of their property in selling it, which is totally understandable. But when done at a large scale, there's a lot of property that's kind of held back because what the property owner thinks it's worth is not really what the market can afford, especially for affordable housing. There's plenty of market demand for affordable housing. It's the cost of construction and the cost of land are the two biggest obstacles to it. So when something's publicly owned, the cost of land usually can be expected to be lower than if it were private. So this still is seen as a viable candidate, but it doesn't provide too much of housing compared to the RHNA. So it's not like the city is leveraging it too much to satisfy its RHNA, but it is something that we see as a valid resource.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me, but that Yep. is also bordered by it's almost surrounded by San Clemente, I think on two sides. So I just wonder how that would come into play. Well, maybe it's too complicated to answer that question, but in terms of NIMBY, if you will, issues, or is this by right if it's identified as one of the parcels?
The way that this property is zoned with the community facility is that housing is allowed by right. So you bypass a lot of the NIMBY concerns or the concerns of the adjacent jurisdictions. And it also eliminates the CEQA analysis, which can take a lot of time and introduce some problems into the development process.
Thank you.
You also had a question there that about ADUs and whether or not they had to have electricity, plumbing, sewage, etc. So the defining characteristics of ADUs that number one, they have to have external access. If they're going to be a separate unit, then somebody can't walk through someone's hallway in order to get access. They have to have external access that's private. With junior ADUs, they don't have to have quite the same facilities as attached or detached ADUs, but they I always flip it around because it's the opposite of what I would prefer. So with the junior ADU, you have to have essentially a 120 volts kitchenette type deal. So you can't have any 240 volts or 220 volts. You can't have any gas lines. You have to have basically a kitchenette where you plug in a hot plate or something like that. But you don't have to have your own bathroom. You can share plumbing facilities in terms of the bathroom and shower. Otherwise, for other ADUs, non-junior ADUs, then you have your higher level kitchenette, and you can have a bathroom, and that external access is really the key thing.
I don't know if I'm still muted, but I have another question. And I think I can make this my last one so you guys can go home and eat or drink or whatever you need to do. So I guess you heard me. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Shoot, I don't remember what law it was, but it was about navigation centers, and that the state, if it's, I think it was, if something's not happening, the state would find a way to further incentivize, and they would make sure that things were happening by right.
Yeah.
How does that differ from the SB2 zone? Because it almost sounds like you're saying, if you don't do it right, the state's going to come in and like make you do it, or I mean, not make you do it, but something. Can you just explain this? Yeah,
that's kind of the common interpretation of it is that if the city's not doing it, then the state will come in and do it. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And it's separate from the low barrier navigation centers, which I can talk to if you want, but I think you're talking about that SB 35, that additional streamlining. So the city. Oh,
you know what? Quick interruption. I realize I'm talking about both. So I did have a question about the further incentivizing piece, but I did have a question about the low barrier navigation centers when it says it must be allowed by right in areas zoned, blah, 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 blah. That sounds, if you could just say more about that too. So both things.
Okay, well, I'll address that one first because I think it's maybe simpler. So state law requires that jurisdictions have at least one zone where they allow emergency shelters by right. This goes and expands upon that and says, okay, now, because emergency shelters do not have to have services that focus on moving people into permanent housing. It doesn't have to allow for pets, all of the things that you see here listed for low barrier navigation centers. So the state law was passed that said, okay, there's these enriched emergency shelters, essentially, that have all of these features. And in some ways, when you look at the additional features these have, they're potentially going to draw a population where there's a focus on safety and privacy. And so there might not be quite as much concern about them. Many people would still be concerned about them, but the law has determined that it is more important to facilitate them. And so in any zone of the city where it allows for mixed use, and that's a mix of residential and non-residential, or if you have non-residential zones that also permit multifamily uses, but they're not quite going to the mixed use format, then low barrier navigation centers must be allowed by right in those zones.
Wow, okay.
On SB 35, so if you take the city's housing need, future housing need is 530, but the lower income, well, let's break it down into, there's lower income need, which is 231 of that. If you divide that by 8, because there's 8 years in the planning period, you'll get just about 29 housing units. So if the city in year 1 of the planning period permits 28 lower income units, then the law kicks in to say, okay, and that year passes, okay, we're seeing that the state sees that you're not getting enough interest, or maybe there's some constraints being that are holding back housing development. If you have, if somebody brings forth a housing development that has 50% lower income housing or more, then that development will be permitted by right. Then there's the above moderate the market rate housing. And I can't remember that number offhand, but I know it's smaller than the lower income need. So let's just say it's 20 units a year that you have to do. And if no housing is really getting done, even at the market rate, you're not getting 20 units in that first year that are permitted, then the state law kicks in and says, okay, if there's projects that have 10% or more lower income housing, so it kind of lowers that threshold for the amount of affordability, those have to be permitted by right. So it's a way that, let's say the city fully embraces doing housing, doing affordable housing, but whether it's because the property owners aren't interested or the development community kind of says, nah, just, not right now, then the state law says, all right, we will make it so that it is as easy as possible to develop housing in the city, but with some public benefit in the form of 10% or 50% lower income housing. And it's really on those two ends of the spectrum of the arena. It's the lower income production and the market rate production. So does that help clarify?
It does. Yeah, it does. And before I don't even know if anyone's here. That's kind of weird, by the way, to not know if anyone's here. But
there are others here.
Okay. I do have one comment, just a comment before we wrap up, if it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a question from Daisy Cruz. Would the Ralph's property become surplus land? Colin, would you be able to answer that?
The Ralph's property would not become surplus land. The surplus land aspect is in connection with an entity like the city that is not subject to property taxes and other taxes. So it's not just any public entity. There's lots of public entities that are still subject to zoning laws, and it's really that zoning law aspect. So if the state of California, which is not subject to local jurisdictional zoning regulations, or the federal government, if they have property that they then deem, or school districts that they deem surplus, then those sites have to get reported in the housing element, and those are identified as very strong candidate sites. But there's not that situation here.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? Maura?
Yeah, thank you. So again, I don't know who's listening, but I just thought I would share this anecdote. So I accompanied a person today to an appointment for mental health care in Costa Mesa, because that's the where people with mental health issues in southernmost county, that's where, people with severe and persistent mental illness, that's where they have to go for county provided mental health, Costa Mesa. So we were talking about housing options for this person who lives on about $1,000 a month from Social Security. And the person working up there just made a comment like that, if you were from Santa Ana, you could probably get into housing, because Santa Ana is building a lot of housing, and then it's earmarked for people from Santa Ana or people who've lived there for a long time. Well, this gentleman's lived in southernmost county for more than 10 years, but we don't have housing for him or people like him. But if he were homeless in Santa Ana, he probably could get into housing. So I just wanted to mention that this is somebody who's lived here for many, many years, a great citizen. He has an income, he's doing everything he can, but he can't afford to live here. And he really can't afford to live anywhere else either. So that's the thing. We're just not taking care of our own in a lot of cases. So I just want to share that.
Thank you, Maura. Any final comments or questions before we wrap up? All right, seeing none. So this concludes our Housing and Public Safety Workshop. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your participation and input, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.